I argue in the book there's sort of the United States tried to introduce almost a third radical wave of its own. And you can see President Bush articulating that in his final speech in Egypt just this weekend. You could also see it in the speech that Condi Rice made in Egypt, in Cairo, in 2005, which is to argue that what the Middle East really needs is democracy and human rights. I mean, it's a proposition with which it's very hard to argue, and you have the virtues of liberal democracies are very evident when you see the mistakes that can be made by countries that don't allow for exchanges of opinion, are based on repression, and essentially based in the end on the desire of the regimes to protect themselves, to maintain basically their own survival. But the problem, I think, with Bush's sort of radical wave is, first, it's a foreign power. It's very hard to be an indigenous radical when you're a great power. And I remember when I was doing my book on Kennedy, Kennedy was very enamored of the idea that somehow the United States had a particular advantage over the old colonial powers like Britain and France as being a revolutionary regime of its own, that it had its own revolution against colonialism. But it never really rang true in the Third World. They never really could see the United States as fellow revolutionaries. It was all a long time ago, and it now had created what seemed to them to be a power that supported the status quo. And it does seem to me that in the United States, that there is a tension in the American policy between being a status quo power, yet dissatisfied with the status quo. That seems to be much of what has happened in the Middle East reflects that. So when Bush is arguing the case for democracy and human rights and opening up, he has a point. The radical message has a point, but he's unable to push it through because in the end, as a former Israeli foreign minister put it, too often in the Middle East, the choice appears between a moderate autocracy versus an Islamic democracy. The mass movements, the popular feeling, is with the real radicals rather than with the sort of liberal radicalism that the Americans and other Western countries are pushing. Moreover, the complexity of local politics does keep on coming back. As we saw when elections were held in Iraq, it isn't philosophical differences, it isn't constituency politics, it's ethnic identities that so often describe the way that people will vote, and electoral systems can encourage it or discourage it, and so you end up with elections aggravating divisions rather than finding ways of healing them. And what seems to me to happen in the Middle East is that although the United States and Britain and France and others at times may seem they've had a sort of civilizing mission, in the way that the regional politics is so powerful that it draws the countries that get involved in the region into its own mores, into its own practices, into its own ways of operating, because that's the sort of challenges that get posed to you. In that way, in that regard, the Middle East is often a sort of a graveyard of foreign policy, not just for the United States. I'd say it's true for almost anybody, including the countries of the region. It's very hard to think of a country that has demonstrated a consistently sure touch in working its way through the cross-currents of the region between Sunni and Shia, between Persian and Arab and Kurd and Jew, between the oil-rich and the poor, between the demographically challenged, the North Africans, between the Gulf. So the divisions within the area, and moving up into Afghanistan and Pakistan, pose enormous challenges for anybody who's trying to operate within the region delicately and sensitively. And so it's inevitable that you end up making mistakes.